The morning sun streamed through the tall windows of Riverside County Courthouse as Judge Margaret Thompson adjusted her reading glasses and reviewed the docket for the day. At 58, she had seen nearly everything in her 23 years on the bench, from corporate fraud to family disputes. Today's case seemed straightforward enough: a property dispute between neighbors that had escalated beyond reasonable limits. What Judge Thompson didn't expect was the slight figure sitting in the witness section, a girl who couldn't be more than 16 years old, wearing a crisp white shirt and navy blazer that looked like a school uniform. Her dark hair was pulled back in a neat ponytail, and she sat with perfect posture, her hands folded in her lap. Most teenagers dragged into court looked uncomfortable, fidgety, or downright hostile. This girl appeared completely at ease, as if she belonged there. The case involved Mrs. Eleanor Hartwell, a 72-year-old retired teacher, and her neighbor, businessman Robert Kane. Kane claimed that Mrs. Hartwell's ancient oak tree had damaged his property during a recent storm, demanding she pay for extensive repairs to his fence, patio, and landscaping. Mrs. Hartwell, represented by a young public defender who seemed overwhelmed by the case's complexities, maintained that the tree was healthy and that Kane had been trying to force her to cut it down for months to improve his property value. As the morning progressed, Kane's expensive attorney presented a compelling case. He had photographs, expert testimony from an arborist who claimed the tree was diseased, and estimates for damages totaling nearly $30,000. Mrs. Hartwell's lawyer struggled to counter the arguments effectively, often stumbling over legal terminology and failing to object when he should have. During the lunch recess, Judge Thompson noticed the young girl approach Mrs. Hartwell's attorney in the hallway. They spoke quietly for several minutes, the girl occasionally pointing to documents in his briefcase. When court resumed, the public defender seemed more confident, his questions sharper and more focused. "Your Honor," the public defender said, "I'd like to call a witness who was present during the storm and can testify about the actual cause of the damage to Mr. Kane's property." Kane's attorney immediately objected. "Your Honor, this witness wasn't on the witness list provided during discovery." Judge Thompson looked at the papers before her. Indeed, the girl's name was nowhere to be found. She was about to sustain the objection when Mrs. Hartwell's lawyer spoke up. "Your Honor, Miss Sarah Chun was indeed present during the incident. She lives in the neighborhood and was an eyewitness to the events in question. The defense has the right to call witnesses who can provide relevant testimony." Judge Thompson studied the girl more carefully. There was something about her demeanor that intrigued her. Despite being in a formal courtroom setting, she showed no signs of nervousness. Her eyes were alert and intelligent, taking in everything around her. "Very well," Judge Thompson decided, "but I want to establish this witness's credibility first. Young lady, please approach the bench." Sarah Chun stood and walked forward with confidence. Judge Thompson looked down at her from the elevated bench. "How old are you, Miss Chun?" 17, Your Honor." "And you live in the same neighborhood as the parties involved in this case?" "Yes, Your Honor. My family moved to Maple Street 3 years ago. We live 4 houses down from Mrs. Hartwell." Judge Thompson decided to test the girl's honesty in a way she had developed over years of dealing with reluctant or unreliable witnesses. It was an informal method she sometimes used, particularly with young people, to gauge their truthfulness and character. "Miss Chun, I'm going to play a little game with you. I call it truth or lie. I'm going to make some statements about what I observe, and you tell me whether I'm telling the truth or lying. Do you understand?" "Yes, Your Honor." "You're wearing a blue shirt." Sarah looked down at her white shirt and smiled slightly. "That's a lie, Your Honor. My shirt is white." "You appear nervous about testifying today." Sarah considered this for a moment. "That's a lie, Your Honor. I'm not nervous. I'm actually quite comfortable in legal settings." This answer surprised Judge Thompson. Most teenagers would admit to being nervous in court, whether it was true or not. The confidence in Sarah's response was unusual. "You've been in a courtroom before today." "That's the truth, Your Honor." "More than once?" "Yes, Your Honor, many times." Judge Thompson's curiosity was now fully aroused. "You're here today because someone asked you to testify on Mrs. Hartwell's behalf." Sarah paused, her expression becoming more serious. That's partially true and partially false, Your Honor. Mrs. Hartwell's attorney did ask me to testify, but only after I approached him. I came here today because I witnessed what actually happened during the storm, and I believe the truth needs to be told. And what makes you think your testimony is so important? Because Mr. Kane's version of events is not accurate, Your Honor. The damage to his property was not caused by Mrs. Hartwell's oak tree. Kane's attorney stood up. Your Honor, I object to this entire line of questioning. This is highly irregular. Judge Thompson held up her hand. Counselor, I'm trying to establish the credibility and reliability of this witness. Please sit down. She turned back to Sarah. Miss Chun, you seem remarkably comfortable with legal proceedings for someone your age. Why is that? I spend a lot of time studying law, Your Honor. It's something that interests me greatly. Just studying, or do you have practical experience? Sarah hesitated for just a moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. I've been involved in several legal matters, Your Honor, mostly helping people in my community understand their rights and navigate legal issues. Kane's attorney stood again. Your Honor, this is becoming absurd. We're allowing a child to waste the court's time with amateur legal theories? Judge Thompson's expression hardened. She didn't appreciate being told how to run her courtroom, especially by an attorney who was clearly underestimating the young woman before the bench. Mr. Davidson, I'll thank you not to tell me how to conduct my courtroom, and I'd suggest you not dismiss this witness based solely on her age. Some of the most insightful testimony I've heard has come from young people who observe the world with fresh eyes and honest hearts. She looked back at Sarah. Miss Chin, before I allow you to testify, I have one more question for our little game. Are you just an ordinary teenager who happened to witness this storm? Sarah met the judge's eyes directly. That would be a lie, Your Honor. I'm not ordinary in the traditional sense. What makes you extraordinary? I've been accepted to Harvard Law School, Your Honor. I'll be starting there next fall, 3 years ahead of my peers. I've also been working with the Legal Aid Society for the past 2 years, helping low-income residents with various legal issues under the supervision of licensed attorneys. The courtroom fell silent. Kane's attorney looked stunned, Mrs. Hartwell's lawyer appeared relieved, and even the court reporter looked up from her machine. Judge Thompson leaned back in her chair, a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. In all her years on the bench, she had never encountered a witness quite like Sarah Chun. Here was a teenager who not only understood the law but had already been accepted to one of the most prestigious law schools in the country. Well, Miss Chun, I think you've more than established your credibility. Please take the witness stand, and let's hear what you have to say about this storm and the damage to Mr. Kane's property. As Sarah walked to the witness stand, Judge Thompson couldn't help but feel that this case was about to take a very interesting turn. She had a feeling that this young legal prodigy was about to demonstrate exactly why age shouldn't be a factor in determining someone's capability or credibility. The afternoon session was going to be far more engaging than she had anticipated. Sarah Chun settled into the witness chair with the same composure she had displayed throughout the morning. The court clerk approached with a Bible, and Sarah raised her right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? So help you God? I do, Sarah replied clearly. Mrs. Hartwell's public defender, energized by his brief consultation with Sarah during the lunch break, approached the witness stand. Please state your name for the record. Sarah Chun, Miss Chen, you testified that you witnessed the storm that caused damage to Mr. Kane's property. Can you tell us about that evening? Sarah turned slightly to address both the lawyer and Judge Thompson. On the evening of March 15th, I was in my bedroom doing homework when the storm began. My desk faces the window that overlooks the street, so I had a clear view of both Mrs. Hartwell's property and Mr. Kane's property. What did you observe during the storm? The wind was very strong, and I could see debris flying around. I was actually watching because storms fascinate me, and I was concerned about the large oak tree in Mrs. Hartwell's yard. It's a beautiful tree, probably over 100 years old. Did you see the tree fall or cause damage to Mr. Kane's property? No, I did not. In fact, the oak tree remained completely intact throughout the entire storm. Not even any large branches fell from it. Kane's attorney jumped up. "Objection, Your Honor. How could the witness possibly see clearly in the middle of a storm at night?" Judge Thompson looked at Sarah. "Miss Chen, can you explain the visibility conditions that night?" "Certainly, Your Honor. While it was evening, it wasn't completely dark yet. The storm began around 7:30 p.m., and there was still some daylight. More importantly, Mr. Kane had recently installed very bright security lights around his property. These lights stayed on throughout the storm and actually illuminated both yards quite well." "Continue with your testimony." "Miss Chun," the public defender encouraged. "What I observed was that the damage to Mr. Kane's fence occurred when his own maple tree fell. This tree was much smaller than Mrs. Hartwell's oak and was located entirely on Mr. Kane's property. It fell directly onto his fence and then bounced onto his patio furniture." "How can you be certain it was Mr. Kane's tree and not Mrs. Hartwell's?" Sarah reached into a small bag she had brought with her. "Your Honor, may I present some evidence I collected?" Judge Thompson nodded. "What kind of evidence?" "Photographs and physical samples, Your Honor. The morning after the storm, I walked through the neighborhood to see the damage. I noticed that Mr. Kane had already removed most of the fallen tree and debris, but I was able to photograph some remaining pieces and collect samples." She handed a folder to the bailiff, who brought it to the judge. "The photographs clearly show that the wood and bark characteristics match the maple tree that was growing on Mr. Kane's property, not the oak tree on Mrs. Hartwell's property. I also have leaf samples that I pressed and preserved." Kane's attorney was on his feet again. "Your Honor, this is ridiculous. We're supposed to accept evidence collected by a child with no training in forensics?" Judge Thompson examined the photographs carefully. They were remarkably clear and well composed, showing detailed close-ups of wood grain, bark texture, and leaf shapes. "Miss Chun, do you have training in evidence collection?" "I've taken several courses through the community college on forensic science and evidence preservation. I'm also an Eagle Scout, so I have extensive knowledge of tree identification and outdoor observation skills." The judge continued looking through the photographs. "These are very thorough, Miss Chun. Can you explain what we're looking at here?" Sarah stood and approached the evidence table with the judge's permission. "Your Honor, if you look at photograph number 3, you can see the distinctive bark pattern of a sugar maple. Photograph number 5 shows the same pattern on the debris I found on Mr. Kane's patio. The bark characteristics of an oak tree are completely different, much rougher with deeper grooves." She pulled out a small container with pressed leaves. "These leaf samples were taken from the debris. As you can see, they're maple leaves with the characteristic 5-pointed shape. Oak leaves have a completely different structure with rounded lobes. Additionally," Sarah continued, warming to her subject, "I researched the property records and found that Mr. Kane had applied for a permit to remove that maple tree just 2 months before the storm. The permit was denied because the tree was healthy and the city has protections for mature trees." Judge Thompson looked up sharply. "How did you access property records and permit applications?" "They're public records, Your Honor. Anyone can request them from the city clerk's office. I went there the day after the storm to research the background of this situation." Kane's attorney looked uncomfortable. "Your Honor, even if this witness is correct about which tree fell, it doesn't change the fact that my client suffered damages that need to be compensated." Sarah turned to address him directly. "Actually, Mr. Davidson, it changes everything legally. If the damage was caused by Mr. Kane's own tree falling on his own property, then Mrs. Hartwell has no liability whatsoever. This is basic property law under the doctrine of act of God or natural disaster exceptions." Judge Thompson was amazed. Not only was this teenager presenting well-organized evidence, but she was also citing legal doctrine accurately. "Miss Chun, you seem to understand the legal implications of your testimony quite well." "Yes, Your Honor, I've researched similar cases extensively. When natural disasters cause property damage, liability typically only exists if negligence can be proven. For Mrs. Hartwell to be liable, Mr. Kane would need to show that she knew her tree was dangerous and failed to address it. However, since the damage was actually caused by his own tree, the case becomes one of unfortunate circumstance rather than negligence. Mrs. Hartwell's lawyer, now gaining confidence, asked, Miss Chun, did you observe anything else that night that might be relevant to this case? Yes, actually. I saw Mr. Kane outside during the storm before his tree fell. He was attempting to cut branches from the maple tree with a chainsaw. The courtroom erupted. Kane's attorney shouted, Objection! While Kane himself looked pale, Judge Thompson banged her gavel. Order, Miss Chun. That's a very serious allegation. Are you certain about what you saw? Absolutely certain, Your Honor. I was concerned for his safety, so I watched carefully. He was using a chainsaw to cut at the base of the tree while the wind was very strong. This is extremely dangerous and could have weakened the tree's stability. Sarah pulled out another photograph. I took this picture the next morning. You can see the chainsaw cuts at the base of the fallen maple tree. The cuts are clearly visible and show that the tree was partially cut through before it fell. Judge Thompson examined this photograph closely. The chainsaw marks were unmistakable, showing several cuts into the trunk of the tree. Your Honor, Sarah continued, this evidence suggests that Mr. Kane's own actions during the storm may have directly caused his tree to fall and damage his property. If someone weakens a tree during a windstorm and it subsequently falls, they cannot claim that the storm damage was purely an act of God. Kane's attorney was frantically whispering with his client, who was shaking his head vigorously. Judge Thompson addressed Kane directly. Mr. Kane, did you use a chainsaw on your maple tree during the storm on March 15th? Kane stood slowly. Your Honor, The tree was making threatening sounds in the wind. I was afraid it might fall on my house, so I thought if I could control where it fell. So you did attempt to cut down the tree during the storm. I was trying to protect my property. Your Honor, Judge Thompson turned back to Sarah. Miss Chen, in your research of similar cases, what did you discover about liability when someone's own actions contribute to storm damage? In cases where property owners take actions during a natural disaster that directly contribute to damage, courts have consistently ruled that they assume liability for the consequences. The legal principle is that you cannot create a dangerous situation and then claim compensation from others for the results. Sarah had essentially dismantled the entire foundation of Kane's case. Not only had she proven that Mrs. Hartwell's tree didn't cause the damage, but she had also demonstrated that Kane's own actions had directly caused the damage. He was seeking compensation for. Judge Thompson realized she was witnessing something extraordinary. This teenager had conducted a more thorough investigation than either attorney involved in the case. Her evidence was methodically collected, properly preserved, and legally relevant. Her understanding of the applicable law was sophisticated and accurate. Miss Chun, have you shared all of this evidence with Mrs. Hartwell's attorney prior to today? No, Your Honor. I tried to contact both attorneys several times over the past few weeks, but I was told I was just a kid and my observations weren't important, Mrs. Hartwell's attorney only agreed to listen to me this morning. During the lunch break, the judge felt a mixture of admiration for Sarah's persistence and frustration with the legal system's initial dismissal of her efforts, Your Honor. Kane's attorney said weakly, I'd like to request a recess to consult with my client about these new developments. I think that would be wise, Counselor. We'll reconvene in 30 minutes. When court reconvened 30 minutes later, the atmosphere had completely shifted. Kane's attorney looked defeated, and his client appeared visibly distressed. Mrs. Hartwell, who had seemed frail and overwhelmed that morning, now sat straighter in her chair, a look of hope replacing the worry that had lined her face. Judge Thompson called the court to order and looked expectantly at Kane's attorney. Counselor, are you ready to proceed? Your Honor, the attorney said reluctantly, after consulting with my client about the new evidence presented, we would like to withdraw our claim against Mrs. Hartwell and dismiss this case. I see. And Mr. Kane, is this your decision as well? Kane stood slowly, avoiding eye contact with both Mrs. Hartwell and Sarah. Yes, Your Honor, I realize now that my actions during the storm were reckless and that Mrs. Hartwell bears no responsibility for the damage to my property. Judge Thompson nodded gravely. Mr. Kane, I want to be very clear about something. What you did was not only dangerous but potentially fraudulent. You attempted to cut down a tree during a dangerous storm which directly caused damage to your own property, and then you tried to hold your neighbor financially responsible for that damage. This is a very serious matter. I understand, Your Honor. I was desperate and made poor decisions. I had significant debt, and I thought if I could get Mrs. Hartwell to pay for the damages, it would solve my financial problems. The admission hung in the air like a thundercloud. Judge Thompson's expression grew stern. Mr. Kane, you've just admitted to filing a fraudulent lawsuit. Are you aware of the potential consequences of this admission? Kane's attorney quickly intervened. Your Honor, my client would like to make a full apology to Mrs. Hartwell and offer to pay any legal costs she has incurred in defending against this claim. Judge Thompson looked at Mrs. Hartwell's public defender. Counselor, what are your client's wishes regarding Mr. Kane's offer? The young lawyer, still somewhat stunned by how dramatically the case had turned around, consulted briefly with Mrs. Hartwell. Your Honor, Mrs. Hartwell is willing to accept Mr. Kane's apology and his payment of her legal costs. She doesn't wish to pursue any further action against him, but she would like the record to be clear that she was completely innocent of any wrongdoing. Very well, Mr. Kane. You will pay all of Mrs. Hartwell's legal costs within 30 days. Additionally, I'm going to order that you make a public apology to Mrs. Hartwell and a donation of $5,000 to the Legal Aid Society in recognition of the resources that were wasted on this fraudulent case. Judge Thompson then turned her attention to Sarah, who had been sitting quietly during these proceedings. Miss Chun, please approach the bench. Sarah walked forward once again, her composure as steady as it had been throughout the day. Young lady, what you accomplished today was truly remarkable. Not only did you conduct a more thorough investigation than the professional attorneys involved in this case, but you also demonstrated a level of legal knowledge and ethical commitment that many seasoned lawyers would envy. Thank you. Your Honor, I simply believe that the truth matters, especially in legal proceedings. I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll be honest with me. What originally motivated you to get involved in this case? Sarah thought for a moment. Mrs. Hartwell reminded me of my grandmother. Your Honor, she's lived in that house for 40 years, and that oak tree means everything to her. Her late husband planted it when they first moved there. When I heard that someone was trying to force her to pay for damage she didn't cause and potentially make her cut down her tree, I knew I had to help. And how did you know that Mr. Kane's version of events wasn't accurate? I was actually doing homework by my window that night, and I saw the whole thing happen. At first, I thought it was strange that Mr. Kane would be outside with a chainsaw during such a dangerous storm. When I heard about the lawsuit, I realized he was trying to blame Mrs. Hartwell for damage he had caused himself. Judge Thompson smiled. Miss Chen, you've mentioned that you'll be attending Harvard Law School next fall. May I ask what area of law you plan to specialize in? I'm particularly interested in civil rights law and helping people who don't have access to good legal representation. Your Honor, cases like this one, where someone with limited resources is being taken advantage of by someone with more money and power. Well, based on what I've observed today, I have no doubt that you'll make an exceptional attorney. In fact, I'd like to write you a letter of recommendation for Harvard, if you'd accept it. Sarah's composure finally cracked slightly as she smiled broadly. I would be honored, Your Honor. Thank you. Judge Thompson then addressed the entire courtroom. I want everyone present to understand what happened here today. We witnessed the power of careful observation, thorough investigation, and moral courage. Miss Chung could have simply minded her own business and allowed this case to proceed. Instead, she took the initiative to discover the truth and ensure that justice was served. She paused to look at both attorneys. I also want to address a troubling aspect of this case. Miss Chen attempted to contact both legal teams multiple times before today, and she was dismissed because of her age. This is a reminder that wisdom and insight don't always come from expected sources. Good lawyers listen to everyone who might have relevant information, regardless of their age, background, or social status. Mrs. Hartwell's public defender looked appropriately chastened. Your Honor, you're absolutely right. I should have taken Miss Chen's calls seriously from the beginning. Learn from this experience, counselor. Miss Chen's thorough preparation and attention to detail is a model that all attorneys should follow. Judge Thompson then turned back to Sarah. Miss Chung, I have one final question for you. What advice would you give to other young people who might find themselves in situations where they witness injustice? Sarah stood a little straighter. I would tell them that age doesn't disqualify you from making a difference. Your Honor, if you see something wrong happening, especially to someone who can't defend themselves properly, you have a responsibility to speak up. Don't let anyone dismiss you just because you're young. The truth is the truth, regardless of who presents it. And if people don't listen to you at first, then you keep trying, Your Honor, you gather evidence, you learn everything you can about the situation, and you find someone who will listen. In this case, it took weeks of phone calls and research, but eventually the truth came out. Judge Thompson nodded approvingly. Excellent advice, Miss Chun. After the formal proceedings concluded and the courtroom began to empty, Mrs. Hartwell approached Sarah with tears in her eyes. My dear, she said, taking Sarah's hands in her own, I don't know how to thank you. That tree is all I have left of my husband, and you saved it. You don't need to thank me, Mrs. Hartwell. I'm just glad the truth came out. What you did today was extraordinary. You're going to make a wonderful lawyer. As they walked out of the courthouse together, Sarah reflected on the day's events. She had started the morning as a high school student who had witnessed a storm. She was ending the day as someone who had successfully conducted a legal investigation, presented evidence in court, and helped ensure that justice was served. Judge Thompson, gathering her papers as the courthouse quieted, couldn't stop thinking about what she had witnessed. In her decades on the bench, she had seen countless cases and met thousands of people, but rarely had she encountered someone who combined such sharp intelligence with such genuine moral conviction. That evening, she called her clerk. Mary, I want you to do something for me. Research all the information you can find about Sarah Chun. I suspect this young woman is going to have a remarkable legal career, and I want to keep track of her progress. 3 months later, Judge Thompson received a graduation announcement in the mail. Sarah Chun had graduated as valedictorian of her high school class. Attached was a handwritten note. Dear Judge Thompson, thank you for believing in me that day in court. You taught me that the legal system works best when people are willing to listen to the truth, regardless of who presents it. I'm looking forward to starting at Harvard in the fall, and I hope to make you proud. Sincerely, Sarah Chun. Judge Thompson smiled as she placed the note in her desk drawer, next to the letter of recommendation she had written for Sarah's Harvard application. She had no doubt that Sarah Chun would indeed make her proud, and more importantly, would make a significant difference in the world of law and justice. The case of Kane versus Hartwell had been officially closed, but its real impact was just beginning. Word of the teenage legal prodigy who had solved a complex case, through careful observation and moral courage, spread throughout the legal community. Law professors used it as an example in their classes, and young lawyers cited it as inspiration for thorough case preparation. But perhaps most importantly, Mrs. Hartwell's oak tree continued to stand tall in her yard, its branches reaching toward the sky, a living symbol of how truth and justice can prevail when someone brave enough stands up to defend them.